All right, guys, so here's what we're going to talk about today. So functional movement, it's one of those buzzwords that you see a lot in training because everybody talks about trying to make as functional movement as possible. If we really look back to the origins of where functional movement training came from, CrossFit really popularized it, so we have them to thank for that. But what is functional movement? Because I think a lot of times we get into this mindset that certain things are functional when really they might not be. So when we look at function of the human body, we are bipedal creatures. So it means we don't walk on all fours, we walk on 2 feet. So when we look at optimal expression of the interactions of our ankle, knee, hip, spine, shoulder, what we're really looking at is this gait cycle, right? It's walking, being able to move in those positions. So when we look at optimizing function, a lot of times people will sit there and they'll be like, oh, well, you know, a squat is the most like this is a functional movement, right? But how often do we do stuff on 2 legs? And I think that's one of the things that we often get conflated. This right here would be considered what we find an expression of function. If I have optimal function in my ankle, knee, and hip, and spine, I can get into this position and I can move in this position and express force through those joints without incurring any injuries, right? So that's an expression of the function of those joints. But when we actually look at functional movement, what we have to think about is how are we moving within that gait cycle? We've talked a little bit about anti-rotation and extension, or anti-flexion, anti-extension, right? Moving through that gait cycle, well, I put force in through one leg, and it's got to go somewhere. I've got to be able to translate that across my body and be able to control those forces and be able to redistribute. So when we look at functional movement, sometimes we got to think a little bit outside the box, right? The great quote that I really like comes from Dr. Jordan Shallow. If you can't stand on one leg, you haven't earned the right to squat on 2. Well, when we look at functional movements, it might be better to start looking at some of these things that aren't necessarily what we see as commonplace. Yes, you know, being strong functionally on 2 legs is great, but when we start to look at actually performing either, you know, muscular balance, whether we talk about building muscle size, muscle tone, if you really want to use that word, that really people just use as a buzzword for building muscle mass, but being able to express some of these things to train functionally, what we're training on single leg, single arm, because we're trying to optimize the function of ankle, knee, hip, spine, shoulder, to be able to move through those ranges of motion, right? So when we actually look at function, we're not looking at necessarily standing on 2, because let's be real, how often do you do stuff on 2 legs? Nobody goes through the store pushing their shopping cart, push, you know, and then push, and then push. No, we move through that gait cycle. So when we're looking at functional movement, we're trying to optimize the expression of those joints, how they interact with each other. That might be, you know, taking our 2-legged squat, taking it down into a split squat, right? We could rear for elevated split squat, being able to move here. Same thing, being able to hinge on a single leg, being able to express ranges of motion at the ankle. When we really look at functional movements, it's not just about squatting on 2 legs, deadlifting, cleaning, you know, pressing. We need to understand that functional expresses, you know, these are expressions of function and not necessarily the functional movement themselves. So just something for you to chew on, think on about, is in terms of how you exercise in the gym, how you translates over to real life as a functional movement.